welcome to another episode of Interregnum, PTO's show within a show with Richard Seymour. In today's episode, we talked about the ongoing crisis within the Labour Party following the resignation of Morgan McSweeney over the appointment of Jeffrey Epstein associate Peter Mandelson to the position of US ambassador. We talked about why the parliamentary Labour Party have for the moment stepped back from trying to oust Keir Starmer, whether a soft left turn from the government is now conceivable, and we went on to discuss just how devastating the ongoing revelations about Peter Mandelson might prove to be for the government, and about the broader crisis of legitimacy facing the British state and its key institutions. Although in the conversation we touch on the royal family and the various accusations against Andrew Windsor, the episode was recorded before his arrest, and also before the news was announced that Global Counsel, the lobbying company co-founded by Peter Mandelson, is to be taken into administration. If you find today's episode useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PTO going, you'll also get access to bonus content. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/polltheoryother to sign up. So, Richard, following the forced resignation of Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, we saw Starmer's cabinet come out in this coordinated show of support for the embattled and, very much publicly despised Prime Minister. Angela Rayner, no longer in the cabinet, of course, but widely expected to be a candidate in any leadership contest, also expressed her support, as did the Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham, which seemed especially preposterous since he's very obviously angling for a return to Parliament in order to unseat Starmer. My assumption, and I imagine yours too, is that those pledges of support were made because the respective leadership candidates just, they don't have their ducks in a row. They aren't ready for a contest, especially the Health Minister, Wes Streeting, who has now been damaged by his long-standing close relationship with the now disgraced Peter Mandelson. And also because they would like to see Starmer take responsibility for a likely defeat in the Gorton and Denton by-election later this month, and the local elections in May, when Labour are expecting devastating results. Alternatively, there have been some media commentators who have claimed that MPs and cabinet members had been genuinely won over by a speech that Starmer gave to them after McSweeney's resignation. Whether those commentators actually believe this because they're just unbelievably credulous, or whether they know it's nonsense, but their own politics closely align with the Labour leadership and they're just, sort of instinctively sympathetic to the Starmer project, that's a bit of an open question. What's your view? Why are the Cabinet and the PLP backing Starmer for the moment? Is there anything else going on that I've missed?
Right. Well, first of all, let's just say, why is the Prime Minister so despised? I think we can both agree that he's a thoroughly decent man, an honourable man, and the irrational hatred for him is inscrutable. Look, I think the tactical consideration, which is making Starmer take responsibility for the dire upcoming results, the by-election in Gorton and Denton, the May election results, rather than allowing him to deflect blame by ascribing it all to divisions and party chaos, as he would, is to the fore. I agree that we can discount the idea that Starmer made a rousing speech in the committee room that swayed all the doubting Thomases in the cabinet, because he's never made a rousing speech in his life. He's never roused anything.
No, sorry, Richard. Just to interject, there was a very similar thing that occurred towards the end of Theresa May's time as Prime Minister, where she gave a supposedly, again, a rousing speech to the 1922 committee. And it's just like, Why don't we get to see these speeches? Why are you saving your best work for, behind closed doors?
It's a convenient fiction.
Yeah.
Look, strategically, I think there is a bigger issue. And I suppose one way to put it is, what's the alternative? Who's waiting in the wings? The NEC's already blocked Andy Burnham. He's not especially left-wing, but he understands the necessity of wooing the left, which he's tried to do, and incorporating some, left ideas and some left-sounding ideas. He's also charismatic in his own way, plausibly plain-spoken northern man. He shed the Blairite image, the suit. You could imagine him defeating reform, just about. Although, frankly, I think in power he would bottle it, he would start pandering to racism quite quickly, he would remember all his Blairite instincts. So what's left then, if not Andy Burnham? Wes Streeting. This is the guy who almost lost his seat to someone who'd never been heard of before. This is a big recipient of private healthcare donations, a union basher, an advocate of the incremental privatization of the NHS, not popular. He was one of the smarmiest briefcase wankers to ever issue from the NUS. And, occasionally does the impression of, having a left-wing idea. Like, for example, the conveniently leaked exchange with Mandelson about Israel committing war crimes. I don't think anyone buys it. And as you say, the fact that he was tight with Mandelson, when he had every reason to know that Mandelson was mates with Epstein, well past the point where it was plausibly deniable what Epstein was up to, that's going to damage him. So who else is there? There's Al Cairns, the soldier Al Cairns. That's what the great British public wants, is to be represented by a grunt who might have killed somebody in action. Or Shabana Mahmood, because she can do racism and brown skin, which is apparently the epitome of progressive politics today. I just don't think the Parliamentary Labour Party has the intellectual or ideological resources or political nous to do anything other than repeat itself like a gassy stomach, regurgitating some sort of Blairite dimwit or blue Labour tosspot, no offence.
Another suggestion that we've seen from sort of, more centrist quarters of the media is this idea that with Morgan McSweeney, who is often identified with the communitarian and socially conservative blue Labour tradition associated with figures like Maurice Glasman and Jonathan Rutherford, that with him having been pushed out, that the government may now shift to the left. And the argument is something like, this left shift might happen partly because the right of the party, both the Blairites and Blue Labour, have been severely discredited by the Mandelson scandal, and figures of the soft left like Ed Miliband, Lucy Powell and Angela Rayner will now feel emboldened to try and impose their agenda on Starmer, who, it's even been suggested, has been quote unquote liberated from McSweeney and the worst of his socially conservative instincts, and that Starmer is now able to show his true, supposedly more liberal colours. Do you think a leftward shift is possible, given the weakness of the right in this moment, and given that there are, genuine differences of political opinion within the PLP, however minor they may appear to us on the far left?
Well, I have to laugh at the idea that Lucy Powell is on the soft left. I don't think that term has much meaning today anyway. Look, Starmer, I would insist, probably doesn't have any true colours beyond grey, career instinct, bureaucratic instinct, no real politics as such. I think, however, the bureaucratic instincts have an implicit political valence because they lend themselves to authoritarianism as a solution to real political contradictions and to loyalty to the institutions. Careerist instincts, too, have an implicitly reactionary drift insofar as they foster deference to wherever power lies. And insofar as Starmer has any instinct in this sort of situation beyond political survival, it is to lash out at the left. I mean, we saw that. You remember the PMQs, I think it was, where he was at the dispatch box after Mandelson's resignation, and he made a big hue and cry about how he'd expelled Corbyn from the Labour Party and should be congratulated for this. I mean, who is that for? Who is that going to convince? The editor of the Times? Not a real constituency.
And just on that point about Starmer having no true colours, I mean, I spoke recently with Paul Holden, the author of The Fraud, which is, very much the most authoritative and comprehensive book on Starmer and McSweeney. And something he suggested is that Starmer's background as a lawyer is key to understanding all of this, in the sense that what Starmer wants is just to be given a brief, right? Whether that brief is the broadly blue Labour agenda furnished by Morgan McSweeney, or whether it was temporarily trying to outflank Rebecca Long-Bailey from the left during the leadership contest in 2020. And this is why he's so apparently comfortable with duplicity and taking up wildly different positions at various points in time. And so while there has for a long time been discussion around the significance of Starmer's background in the law, especially amongst his admirers, and there it's sort of in terms of his eye for detail, it's about being forensic when he's at the dispatch box and all that sort of thing. But that it's actually more, as Holden describes, it's about being adaptable to whatever brief he's furnished with by whoever his handlers are at any given point in time.
I mean, that sounds right to me. But I think he could so brazenly do over Labour members and then U-turn because they didn't matter. Labour members were the enemy in the press. but you can't betray Tory editors and business donors so easily. Look, it's not impossible that Starmer could do a left feint. I think that's what it would be. I think it's unlikely, but if it did happen, it would collapse incredibly fast. It's not just about Starmer, and it's not even just about, the material and institutional conditions of being a prime minister. It's about the historical destiny of Labourism when it has exhausted its real possibilities. We can see Labourism historically as an attempt to represent the working class as an estate within an existing national life, where Marxism holds that the proletariat is the universal class insofar as it's capable of grasping itself as such, as the class whose emancipation abolishes all classes. Labourism kind of represents the working class, at least historically did, as an amalgam of sectional interests whose true universality is the nation. So essentially what it offered was a gestalt form of recognition in a concrete ethical life. And what I mean by that is something like what Hegel discusses with the term Sittlichkeit, where essentially you have institutions that actually embody some version of freedoms, norms, justice, and so on. And labourist ethical life was the life of the unions, the cooperatives, working men's clubs, and it was mediated through the state, in which the condition of recognition as a working class citizen was political passivity.
It's a bargain, it's making a deal, it's carving out a space within capitalism for a somewhat better, more livable life for the working class, but nothing beyond that. And that's the price for respectability, right, is making that deal.
That was essentially the labourist idea, because ultimately Labour's commitment was to the nation, meaning the nation state. So, political passivity. We have to separate economics and politics. You can have your strikes, but you're not doing politics. Patriotic deference to the institutional arrangements, the British Empire, racism, patriarchy, all that stuff. This isn't pure repression, obviously. It did enable organized labor to get footholds that yielded not just genuine reforms, but also expanded its own capacities to act. It also meant that labor became a party of the state, penetrated by the state, restructured by the state. There were more radical possibilities at the base of the party, but the setup of the broad church was always that radicalism would remain in the pews, never in the pulpit.
Yeah, this is Tony Benn's famous line about the Labour Party never having been a socialist party, but always having had socialists in it, although now fewer in number than ever after Starmer's purges, and the ones that remain have been very much hanging on by their fingernails.
Yeah, the one problem for the Blairites and the Starmerites has been their inability to recognise that hegemonizing the left of centre electoral field was a good thing for them. But exactly right. Ultimately, I think you can see that the trajectory of Labour is to move through a series of mediations that ultimately exhaust its historical possibilities, which is where we are now. So you have a period of interwar reformism, where they look for quantitative electoral majorities, never achieved, to somehow add up to a qualitative transformation, socialism supervening on capitalism. After 1945, you get a higher mediation in which Labour, as I say, gains partial recognition, but it's history. It's certain contingencies, the war, weakening of the capitalist class, popular radicalization, that supplies what the form of Labourism couldn't do by itself.
Yeah, and depends on the existence of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc as well. Right?
Absolutely. So a whole series of other conditions. From the late 1960s, the contradictions start to return in a major form. The militancy at the base, the erosion at the margins as the party's, Westminster state form, its UK imperial nationalism sees it start to lose grounds to Scottish and Welsh nationalism, subaltern nationalisms. And from there, you see social democracy abdicate its own previously assured terrain. Thatcherism occupies some of those spaces that it's vacated with its own kind of populist response. And then Labour begins to evacuate itself of its own determinate content. The apogee of that is Blair's the idea that we should go back to Victorian liberalism because it was a big mistake to ever break from Victorian liberalism. So negating Labourism's content while preserving the shell. So Labour survives as an organization by internalizing and institutionalizing the perspectives of its erstwhile enemies. And meanwhile, the universality of the state, the nation state, actually becomes the universality of global capital, as in Blair's sort of global Britain line. And that's what Peter Mandelson openly fought for from his early days when he was working as Kinnock's comms advisor and drawn into the Maxwell milieu and befriended Ghislaine Maxwell. That's probably, we don't know this, but I reckon that's probably how he met Epstein in the first place.
Because her father was the owner of the Daily Mirror, amongst other things.
Amongst other things, yes.
Yeah.
What we see after 2020 is three moments of exhaustion, if you like. So there's the unavailing Milibandian synthesis of left and right, where they try to use reactionary energies around immigration and borders to shore up some idea of community that could resist the encroachments of capital without really developing a new concrete universality. You have the Corbyn era, which, does have some insurgent promise, but it kind of devolves into a fairly timid and confused parliamentary leftism. Partly that's just contingent, like Brexit was confusing. They didn't have a good answer to that. Corbyn was indecisive. McDonnell was ultimately cleaving to the right. But I think it was largely because it didn't have the resources to sublate the contradiction, if you like, because it came from nowhere. And now we have Starmerism, which is, what is Starmerism? I mean, I think it's basically a form of recursion. It's a stuck record politics in which the party can only repeat the most memorable catchphrases and tunes from haute Blairism, remixed with some communitarian and racist AI slop. Instead of a concrete ethical life, as I discussed earlier, we get abstract universality, we get responsibility, decency, security, all those glittering generalities. And the relation to the unions is increasingly kind of ad hoc and clientelist. The party itself has become a hollow state form, an auxiliary of Westminster power that is institutionally hostile, even to its own most moderate self-expressions, of which Andy Burnham is one, and a culled-back membership and a rudderless PLP that is structurally incapable, not just accidentally, of rising to the occasion. I think that this reflects the terminus of Labourism as a distinctive formation, whatever else happens to the shell. And that's why I think we're not going to see a soft left turn of any kind, even in the highly vitiated sense of that term, as in, you might have seen John McTernan's proposed agenda for Starmer after Mandelson in The Guardian. I don't think we're going to see any of that.
Would it be, in your view, actually desirable for Starmer to take a moderate left turn? Is the destruction of Labour, is its personification, is that something we should necessarily welcome and cheer on, given that, there are no guarantees that the Green Party or any other party to the left of Labour would be able to form a government at the next election or subsequently even?
Yeah, look, I don't want Starmer to do a left turn. I don't want any form of left associated with a project that is currently deservedly imploding. I think it would be damaging. The more he cleaves right, the better for the Greens electorally, the better for the left generally. I think if Starmer attempted a left turn, first of all, he would not be persuasive. Second of all, he wouldn't actually do very much, so it would be largely a rhetorical feint. Thirdly, it wouldn't satisfy anyone. Labour's vote would still collapse. The Labour right would blame Starmer's left-wing instincts. Remember, they're capable of imagining anything. They thought that Brown was a secret socialist. And of course, you're right, there's no guarantees that a left of Labour formation can win, but then, where are the guarantees in this political situation? No political outcome is guaranteed other, I would say, than Labour's implosion. And that means that there's an opportunity for electoral realignment, and we should seize it.
Just going back to Mandelson for a moment. So the notion that Starmer can ride out the scandal seems pretty unlikely, given that there will be, revelations for months to come as the files and messages are released. We're also pretty likely to see further corruption scandals related to Mandelson, and not just due to the unusually large number of people in the PLP whose background is in lobbying, and with the media more emboldened than is usually the case to actually do a bit of scrutinising of that. Despite the scale of coverage that the Mandelson affair has had, would it be reasonable to say that a lot of the coverage actually understates just how devastating it's going to be for the government going forward, and how it will just further bleed what little authority Starmer has? And, today we're also talking in the context of the defeat of the government over Palestine Action and the reverse of the policy to delay some of the local elections in May because of an expected defeat in the courts.
Yeah. Well, taking a cue for that, let us, for the sake of a laugh, be Marxist about it. If Starmer's agenda wasn't already imploding, if his authority was not already a joke, then I think it's quite likely that he would survive this. Because if his political offer hadn't been reduced to the basic simulacrum of competence and personal integrity, the ability to chair a meeting, then he would have at least a core support to fall back on. Like, that's how reactionary politicians succeed and survive. The Mandelson affair would obviously still be damaging, but it would be seen as extrinsic to the basic purpose of the government. And Starmer, he could fire a few people, heads roll, say sorry, rely on a sort of public inquiry of some kind, standard ruling class therapy, as Tariq Ali once called it, to expiate the sin. That's not going to work here because I don't know if you saw it, James Meadway wrote a New Statesman essay talking about how the country is becoming poorer and angrier, and almost everything Labour is doing within its austerity and fiscal constraints and its right-cleaving politics ends up attacking and alienating some constituency that they would actually need. So I think this is really structural. And that might also be the sense in which the media underestimates what's coming, because, of course, journalism, especially lobby journalism, is so episodic, so fragmented that it doesn't have the wherewithal to represent to the public, to itself even, a structural deadlock. And the top journalists get by through being clubbable, through being amiable to power, while portraying themselves as knowing, cynical inquisitors.
There's also just their class position, right? The very prominent senior lobby journalists are just making a lot of money, right? So their sense of the amount of sort of tumult in the country at large is perhaps not what it should be, because they are entirely insulated from the cost of living crisis and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when some journalists would complain about the term Westminster bubble and indignantly lash out. But I think it's never been clearer that they're inhabiting a bubble. And it's not just a Westminster bubble. Quite rightly, as you say, this is an upper middle class bubble. I think you're also right to alight on, the high proportion of MPs from fields of public relations, corporate advisories, lobbying, that kind of thing. Because that just creates a sense that the problem is endemic to the political class. It's not just a contingent degradation of public life in a few instances. So yeah, I mean, I don't think Starmer has seen his worst days yet, but that is mostly for systemic reasons. The rhythm of document releases, stalled in part by police inquiries and all the rest of it, that's going to feed into the general disquiet.
On Mandelson himself, lobby journalists and many other centrist political commentators who have direct experience of talking to him and having him as a source and so on, they've repeatedly referred to Mandelson's charm, something, of course, which has never translated into any apparent public affection for him, not even the sort of temporary popularity that somebody like Tony Blair could command. And this view of Mandelson as likable and charming seems to have always been confined to the political class and the media, who largely cheered on his appointment as US ambassador, of course. What do you think Mandelson's appeal was to those sectors? What do they mean when they describe him as charming?
I think he was charming in the same way that Epstein was charming. What we know about Jeffrey Epstein is that he was very good at sizing people up, telling them what they wanted to hear, if and only if they were important and useful to him. I mean, this is a tangent, but it's one of the many things that's so tragic about l'affaire Chomsky, that he could be such an easy mark and so dazzled by someone who I think objectively anyone would recognize as a mediocrity, even if you didn't know he was a predator. So, Mandelson is charming in that way, I think. We know from Sophie Ridge of Sky News that if you're not important, he's not interested. As soon as you have any clout at all, he's on you like a bad rash. He's either threatening you or he's trying to get you sacked, as he tried to do to editors and what have you, or he's serenading you, he's sympathizing with you, he's inviting you into the halls of power, he's promising you tips and leads. I mean, this sort of manipulative charm works. It's seductive. There's still a question there, though, because Mandelson was notorious in the 1990s for the dark arts. Now, he flaunted his reputation as the Prince of Darkness. He used control of personal information, hostile briefings, lobbying to knife people in the back, people who were his colleagues, threaten them, try to get them sacked. And I think it's much like the guff about Starmer being a thoroughly decent man. You really have to wonder at the strategic blind spots and the implicit value judgments of anyone describing Mandelson as charming. And the lobby journalists who, as you rightly say, guffawed, when Starmer gave that cringeworthy, ingratiating speech about Peter when he was appointed to US ambassador
Yeah,
post.
well worth looking for that if you haven't seen it or if you don't remember it too well.
It's a very revealing bit of footage. I mean, they could have been saying, why are you appointing an Epstein associate to the top diplomatic post in the UK? Instead, they had a good old laugh. I think that revealed what their values are.
Could it be argued that it's even worse than that? That part of Mandelson's appeal is his transgressiveness, that he's always been quite overtly on the make, that he at least has always hinted at a kind of, a real sort of contempt for conventional morality, and that it's precisely that sort of frisson of transgressiveness that is part of both Epstein and Mandelson's appeal. The comments of New Labour apparatchik Jeff Morgan seem pretty noteworthy in this regard. So he posted on social media the following: I never met Epstein, but I knew Mandelson from the early 90s onwards in various different roles. I was never a fan, and he knew that, which meant I was on the very long list of people he assiduously whispered against. He and Epstein had both intelligence and charm, and the revelations are reminders of how irresistible charm can be and how important it is to see through it and judge people's true qualities and integrity. Yet I suspect part of the appeal of both Epstein and Mandelson goes beyond this. It may have been precisely the hint of evil which attracted and excited so many people in politics and business, and a surprising number at the heart of the current UK government, a sense of being privy to dark arts and transgression. Some of the commentary may have this wrong. It's not that the very visible vices were ignored, but rather that they were, in both subtle and not so subtle ways, attractive to a certain kind of man.
Yeah, I think that's true up to a point. I mean, you remember that one of the main cultural reflections on New Labour, the thick of it, was kind of laden with an obvious awe and admiration for the kind of Mandelson Campbell figure, somebody with diabolical energy and manipulative skill and so on. I think that quite a lot of what happens in UK politics can be tracked to that basic fantasy of having that kind of power and being that kind of sociopath. But honestly, I also think most journos are professional middle-class people who like to think themselves as nice, responsible individuals, civic-minded, not people who would admire real transgression. And I mean, the dark arts of spin, I think they would see that as just playing the game, like it's a very cynical purview on politics. Abuse on the Epstein scale, I'm not sure. I think that's something different. I think that is rightly so, and one could be relieved at this, a red line, even for these people.
What we've seen seems to reveal Mandelson to be motivated hugely by financial gain and parlaying his contacts and his political prominence into material rewards. But rather than being an outlier, as so many members of parliament are now desperate to portray him, he seems rather to be an extreme example of a much broader malaise, a political class that is focused as never before on material gain. They're disinterested in actual public service, believe in their own ability to act with impunity, and there's that preoccupation with securing a big payday after their formal political careers are over. And this is all something that Aaron Davies in particular has written a lot about. Corruption in politics is hardly a new thing, but do we see a real step change from the New Labour years onwards, where we increasingly see politicians who are out for themselves to a more radical degree, or do you think that's to be a bit sort of sepia-tinged about the past and to be a bit nostalgic?
Well, I've always found Aaron Davis' analysis of the new elites to be quite persuasive within its own limits. The idea that public service is a real value has certainly been emptied of its content to the extent that the incorruptible are countercultural and aberrant. But I don't think this starts with New Labour. I think Davies tracks it to the upstart Thatcherite yuppies. He describes how new leaderships are not intellectually hefty figures. They're not people with any real understanding of how a country works. They may understand how a business works, which to them is often the same thing, but rather they are people who know how to chair a meeting. They're good at face-to-face encounters. They're good at empathizing and connecting with someone for very brief windows. And their supreme gift in that regard is manipulation.
And do you think there's a meaningful distinction between Thatcher and the people you described that she brought into politics? You know, that the results of her policies may indeed have been the evisceration of the idea of public service, but that's not what she herself intended, and that she doesn't, you know, for all her, you know, manifold flaws and for all that she's rightly a hate figure of the left, that she doesn't quite belong to the phenomenon that Davies describes, or if she does, it's as a sort of transitional figure.
Yeah, you could say she was a vanishing mediator. I mean, I think she was an old-fashioned political fighter, but she was also a committed Hayekian, you know, an enemy of any of these big ideas about public service. I don't think Davis mentions this specifically, but the whole ethos of the state was rewritten along the lines of public choice theory. And that was Thatcher's decision to get civil servants to read and internalize William Niskanen, one of the major authors of this kind of theory, and to change practices accordingly. So the idea is there is no public interest. All bureaucrats are budget maximizers. Everyone is self-maximizing. Voters are clients. Public service is hypocrisy, and so on. To deal with that, you have to create internal markets, budget caps, quangos, etc. And you have to accept and internalize and valorize enlightened self-interest as something to be encouraged rather than something to be controlled. Of course, it became logical that being in government would then become a kind of capital asset, convertible into, you know, corporate chairmanships, executive posts, business lecture circuits. And so once one has been booted out, one has somewhere to go and make a big ton of money. For a large number of people, I think whatever drives them to get elected in the first place, all the incentives once you're there are designed so that you look out for those who can help you self-maximize, not those who, you know, voted for you in the first place. And in a way, the very idea of corruption itself has been transformed. I think at the level of political elites, if not in wider common sense, it's no longer sort of corruption per se to make money out of being in government or to accept bribes as gifts, you know, or to take corporate donations in exchange for advocating some specific policy and so on. I think what is corrupt is to give voters what they want, because that's called buying votes. You know, that's what failed states do. That's how you get Venezuela. So remember, Starmer took £100,000 in donations to support his personal lifestyle, most of it from Lord Wahid Ali. And a lot of the MPs and journalists who came out to defend him insisted, you know, there's nothing intrinsically inappropriate in this. I mean, who wouldn't take a free Taylor Swift concert? You know, would your kids ever forgive you for turning that down?
Might turn down the Coldplay ticket, perhaps. But, yeah.
I think you would, if you were sensible, you'd also turn down Taylor Swift. But what the fuck do I know?
Controversial, Richard. Yeah, but gone.
Oh, I see. Okay, you're going to defend Taylor Swift.
Not me.
Charlie XCX next.
I'm personally not a big fan. I mean, I am a Charlie XCX fan, but I'm not a Swiftie. But you know, there will be some listeners who are. So tread carefully.
Come at me, motherfucker. I'm not scared of you. Like, what are you going to do to me? Sing me a sad little song about how you're on your own, kid? Fuck that shit. Look, anyway, I think it's telling to me that the red line is being friends with a major sex trafficker and child abuser and forwarding sensitive government information to them is about the only perk of office that can get you into real trouble these days. And even then, as you'll remember, they really tried not to let that little issue get in Mandelson's way. They really tried.
Yeah. And we're successful for a long time. How damaging do you think for the government are the recent revelations regarding Labour Together's efforts at smearing Sunday Times journalists, which Keir Starmer has since announced there will be a Cabinet Office investigation into, try not to laugh, especially given that much of the media now presumably is aware that Starmer is on the way out and therefore maybe prepared to do more digging than usual. And also because, of course, in the case of Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York, the journalists in question, the McSweeney crowd went after respected mainstream journalists. But yeah, how much trouble do you think they're in over this?
Oh, God. How can it not be damaging? It's damaging for Labour Together, obviously, damaging for Morgan McSweeney, and one Josh Simons MP.
Very quiet on social media lately, yes.
How did that happen? And it will also be damaging for the internal morale of the Times, which, you know, made itself so hospitable to the Mandelson-McSweeney faction, and whose political editor is married to one of the authors of the report that was said to be smearing two of its star journalists, who you mentioned, Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York, as Russian stooges. And said report author is himself a former Times journalist. So Starmer certainly doesn't want to take any heat from this, and that's why he's ordered a Cabinet Office inquiry But I think, it's just going to hurt him collaterally anyway. Even if no one ultimately points the finger at him in any official way, everyone knows that he's a creature of the Labour Together machine. It wouldn't be where he is without it. So that machine is not broken. I think I should, for the sake of some listeners, review what's alleged. I mean, the idea is that in 2023, Josh Simons was working at the Labour Together think tank, and he hired a PR firm called APCO to investigate a number of journalists. It's not just Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York. John McAvoy, who I think works at Declassified, Paul Holden, the author, Matt Taibbi, were among them. And what they had in common was having published exposés based on internal correspondence of misconduct, like, for example, Morgan McSweeney failing to declare £730,000 in donations. Pogrund and York's piece was obviously very high profile. It provoked Labour Together, it panicked them. They turned the APCO report, which falsely accused Pogrund, Holden, and the rest of using material from a Russian hack, over to the National Cybersecurity Centre, which I think is part of GCHQ. Or rather specifically, I think Josh Simons turned it over to them, which, if you think about it, is outrageous. Now, of course, the NCSC said, oh, this is baseless. So Simons spent tens of thousands of Labour Together pounds for Drek. He then, we learned today, employed his lawyers to contact journalists and warn them off Paul Holden, with the specific implication being that, if you publish something he says, you might be susceptible to legal action. Simons denies any wrongdoing. He blames the APCO. He says they went beyond the legal contract. They, in turn, insist that they only did what they were contracted to do. And I kind of suspect that Josh Simons is, to use the parliamentary language, a lying scumbag, because it's reported, I can't prove this, but it's reported that Pogrund et al. Were specifically named on the contract. I haven't seen the contract. There's some other interesting details in all this. I mean, one thing that raised my eyebrows is that in February 2024, Pippa Crerar of The Guardian...
Also very quiet on social media lately. Please go on.
Wrote to Paul Holden, one of those who was falsely maligned, saying that the paper would be reporting on a story that the NCSC was investigating a report of a hack, which was supposed to be the origin of his stories about Labour Together. Question is, how did The Guardian come by that story? I'm not saying Josh Simons gave it to them. I don't know that for sure, but I'm certainly thinking it very loudly. The story was never published. It's pretty clear that Holden would have sued for defamation, but both Taibbi and Holden infer that the attempt to go public with the NCSC investigation was in fact an attempt to scare Holden and others off upcoming exposés. Now, if all or most of that is true, then I can only see it as the product of what we were talking about earlier, an infantile sense of self-importance and a jejune infatuation with being clever and Machiavellian and transgressive. It's the behavior, not of the masters of the dark arts, but of complete fuckwits playing at soldiers. And it's actually very funny.
Yes, I mean, there was a good episode of the podcast that Jeremy Gilbert and Alan Finlayson do, where they're basically describing what was going on as the politics of the stitch up in the a local NUS branch at a university amongst Labour students. It's that sort of thing, but applied to some extremely important institutions and much more widely, and obviously it's blown up in their face. Are you surprised that McSweeney and Josh Simons made, the sort of Watergate error of not confining themselves to attacking the left and people like Paul Holden and so on, but then instead they indeed went after Pogrund and Harry York, people who our media and political class, they think those people matter, right? And those people can very much defend themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, Josh Simons hasn't a ball hair to his name. I'm not surprised at him behaving like a Labour student whose, power has gone to his head. But this was supposedly known about by McSweeney and the gang, and not one of them said, "What the fuck are you doing? Wind your neck in, you idiot." And so not only did they attack people who mattered, employed at a more or less friendly newspaper, but they created a scandal that is far worse than the undeclared donations that panicked them in the first place. Like, that donation story was maybe a scandal for about a day, and then it fizzled out. This is idiocy. This is panic. And now Now, Alex, I really am praying for Josh Simons, hoping and praying, because I would really hate to see a couple of irate Times journalists impale him on a spit, metaphorically speaking,
Of
and
course.
turn him slowly over a raging fire, again, metaphorically speaking, until his eyeballs metaphorically melt and his liver is metaphorically toasted pate. I think that would be a tragedy if Simons was left metaphorically for dead in a ditch somewhere. No right-thinking person wants to see that, and I will be praying for the dozy little bastard.
Yes, yeah, I think you're speaking both for me and probably for all of our listeners there, Richard. That's very touching. It can be interpreted narrowly as a problem for the Labour Party, but the Epstein scandal has, of course, also drawn in the royal family, who had, until recently, seemed to have been relatively successful at disassociating themselves from the former Prince Andrew. And we've seen, a decline in public support for the royals. Public respect for the political class, the media, all at rock bottom. Neither Labour nor the Tories nor Reform have a plausible economic model to replace the one destroyed by the financial crisis. Perhaps most ominously from the standpoint of defenders of the status quo, the position of the middle classes, as James Meadway describes in that article that you mentioned earlier, is ever more precarious. The threat of downward mobility is ever more real. And the crucial consent of those middle layers for the existing economic order appears to have really eroded very dramatically. Given all of that, just how febrile and explosive do you think the current situation is in the UK at the moment?
Well, I think you're exactly right in what you summarize. And we have a combination of exhaustion. The old growth formula no longer works. They can't come up with a new one that secures consent, maybe because growth is the wrong objective. We have widespread institutional distrust because people don't recognize themselves in the institutions. And that's all been accelerated by a series of elite debacles that go far beyond government. The Iraq War, the credit crunch, austerity, the COVID debacles, Epstein scandal. I think they all implicate the wider institutional life of British society. It goes deeper too. I mean, I referred to Labourism as representing a particular kind of ethical life with certain limited forms of solidarity and recognition built into it, but that's all gone. Solidarity as an organized life form has dwindled. There is no recognition, just management. Humiliation is a structuring feature of daily experience. And people defensively, in response to that, adopt competitive and instrumental attitudes to those around them. And then, paranoia as a reflex of that powerlessness, of feeling surplus to the social whole, becomes quite widespread. So in and of itself, that sort of thing could just produce total passivity, resignation, alienation. And for many people, that's exactly what happens. Politicians don't care about me. Why should I care about them? Everyone lies. Everyone's greedy. I'm just going to look after me and mine. That's not really a livable condition. It's not sustainable. And in practice, what happens is that people oscillate between fatalism and a kind of absolutist moral fury when things get bad that seeks political expression in a barren environment. And that's why, we have these massive street mobilizations sometimes that come out of nowhere, and sometimes violent riots, without it really threatening the political setup. That's why there's such a pronounced voluntarism among those trying to organize. That's also what allows for novel politicization, some of them birthed by, online shitstorms, to achieve a reach that far exceeds their organized depth. It's a highly volatile situation. And given the nature of the discontents, particularly that fear of downward mobility, given the structured dispositions of mass media and government, the money and organizing that goes into rightist media ecologies, and frankly, given the remaining political immaturity and disarray on parts of the left and the continued stagnation of the trade unions, you would expect the situation to be contradictory, but to lean more towards reaction or fascisation than radicalism. And that, frankly, is exactly what we see. So yeah, I think we're going to see implosions, and I think we're going to see explosions, and we're going to see breakdowns and riots, but there will be opportunities amid much nastiness.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/polltheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.